Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we're pulling back the curtain on stories that the mainstream media is barely scratching the surface on. From a suspicious mass poisoning at a police training facility in Hong Kong, to a political summit in Florida that reads like an authoritarian book club, to a pair of Cybertrucks that spontaneously combusted in a Santa Monica parking garage, these stories are connected in ways you might not expect.
I'm Maya Clarity, and let me tell you, when we started digging into tonight's lineup, the threads we found running between these stories were remarkable. We're talking about institutional accountability, political power plays, corporate liability, and the question that ties it all together: who is watching the watchers? Stay with us, because by the end of this broadcast, you're going to see this week's news in an entirely different light.
We've got 4 major stories tonight, each one verified through primary sources, and each one raising questions that nobody else seems to be asking. We're going to take you deep inside each one, and then we're going to connect the dots. That's what Truth Report does. That's why you're here.
So buckle up. We're starting tonight in Hong Kong, where dozens of police trainees have been struck down by what authorities are calling a possible food poisoning cluster. Possible. That's a word doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, and we're going to unpack exactly why.
And before we get there, a reminder: everything we report tonight is sourced, cited, and verified. We don't do speculation. We do investigation. Let's get into it. Breaking news out of Hong Kong tonight, where health authorities have launched an investigation into a mass illness event at what the Department of Health is carefully describing as a training institute. Reporting from the South China Morning Post confirms that 53 trainees, 48 male and 5 female, aged 20 to 40, began developing severe symptoms Thursday evening. We're talking abdominal pain, diarrhea, vomiting, and fever. This is not a mild stomach bug. This is a cluster event affecting dozens of people simultaneously.
And right out of the gate, Alex, let's talk about what's conspicuously absent from the official statement. The Department of Health did not name the Hong Kong Police College. They referred to it only as a training institute. It took a source speaking to the South China Morning Post to confirm that these are police trainees. Now, why would the government obscure that detail? When 53 people at any school or workplace fall ill at once, you name the institution. That's basic public health transparency. Unless, of course, you have reasons not to.
Exactly right. And let's put those numbers in context. 53 people falling ill within roughly the same timeframe, Thursday evening onward, that's not random. That's a common source outbreak, which means epidemiologists are almost certainly looking at a single meal or a single food preparation facility. The symptom profile, the combination of abdominal pain, diarrhea, vomiting, and fever, is consistent with bacterial contamination, potentially Salmonella, Staphylococcus aureus, or Clostridium perfringens, depending on the incubation period.
And here's where the investigative questions start piling up. Who is contracted to provide food services at the Hong Kong Police College? What are the inspection records for that facility? How often are food safety audits conducted? Because in institutional settings like police academies, military bases, and prisons, food service contracts are often awarded through government procurement processes that can be opaque at best and corrupt at worst. The lowest bidder doesn't always mean the safest kitchen.
That's a critical point. Institutional food poisoning outbreaks are frequently the result of cost-cutting in food preparation, inadequate refrigeration, improper cooking temperatures, poor hygiene protocols among staff. And when the institution in question is a police college, there's an added layer of concern. These are trainees. They're in a hierarchical environment where reporting illness or complaining about food quality can be seen as weakness. How many of those 53 trainees suffered in silence before the numbers became too large to ignore?
The South China Morning Post report indicates that all affected individuals sought medical treatment, and none have required hospitalization so far, which is a relief. But the fact that the Department of Health has launched a formal investigation tells you the scale is significant enough to warrant serious attention. What we don't know yet is whether environmental health officers have collected food samples, whether the kitchen has been shut down pending results, or whether any food handlers have been tested.
And there's a broader pattern here that we need to name. Hong Kong's government institutions have faced increasing scrutiny over transparency in recent years. The decision to omit the name of the police college from the official health statement fits a pattern of information control that we've seen across multiple government agencies. When the public can't identify which institution is affected, they can't ask follow-up questions. They can't file freedom of information requests. They can't hold specific administrators accountable. The anonymity isn't protecting the trainees, it's protecting the institution.
We'll be watching this story closely. If the investigation confirms bacterial contamination from the food supply, the next question is accountability. Will the food service contractor face penalties? Will procurement practices be reviewed? Or will this be quietly resolved with a change in menu and a press release that buries the details? History tells us which outcome is more likely, but Truth Report will be here to make sure the questions keep getting asked.
Absolutely. 53 people sickened. That's not a footnote. That's a public health failure, and someone is responsible. We'll stay on it. Now we turn to Florida, where tomorrow, President Donald Trump will host leaders from at least 10 Latin American countries at a golf resort in Miami. The Guardian is reporting on this summit, and what jumps off the page isn't who's attending, it's who's been deliberately excluded. The presidents of Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, the three largest economies in Latin America, were not invited.
Let that sink in. You're hosting a summit about Latin America's future, and you leave out Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. That's like hosting a European summit and forgetting to invite Germany, France, and Spain. Experts quoted by The Guardian are calling it an ideological guest list, and that's being generous. What we're looking at is a diplomatic loyalty test dressed up as a regional conference.
The Guardian's reporting makes clear that since returning to power, Trump has pursued what the article describes as a dramatic and at times deadly crusade to reshape America's standing in the region and outmuscle China's growing influence. But the method here is telling. Rather than engaging with the full spectrum of Latin American leadership, including democratically elected leaders who happen to disagree with Washington, this administration is cherry-picking its allies and pretending the rest of the continent doesn't exist.
And let's name who is at the table. We're talking about leaders who align with Trump's ideological framework, right-wing, nationalist, often authoritarian-leaning governments. This is a summit of the willing, not a summit of the region. And the diplomatic implications are enormous. When you exclude Brazil's Lula, Mexico's leadership, and Colombia's Petro, you're not just snubbing individuals. You're signaling to the entire hemisphere that Washington's partnership is conditional on ideological compliance.
And here's the strategic blunder that experts are flagging. Trump's stated goal is to counter China's influence in Latin America. But China doesn't care about ideology when it cuts deals. Beijing will invest in left-wing governments, right-wing governments, military juntas, it doesn't matter. China's approach is transactional and universal. Trump's approach is ideological and exclusive. So by excluding Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, he's effectively pushing the three largest Latin American economies closer to Beijing. It's a self-defeating strategy.
The Guardian describes Trump's regional doctrine as theatrical, and I think that's exactly right. Hosting this at a palm-dotted golf resort in Miami is the aesthetic. It's designed for the photo op, for the imagery of strongmen shaking hands on manicured lawns. But real diplomacy, the kind that actually shapes regional stability, trade flows, and security cooperation, requires engaging with leaders you disagree with. That's not weakness. That's statecraft.
Let's also examine the domestic politics at play. Florida is home to large Cuban, Venezuelan, and Nicaraguan diaspora communities, many of whom fled left-wing governments. A summit of right-wing Latin American leaders in Miami is as much a domestic political event as it is a foreign policy one. It plays to a specific electoral base. It reinforces a specific narrative. And it comes at the expense of actual regional engagement.
And the human cost of this approach doesn't get discussed enough. When the United States freezes out the governments of countries that are home to hundreds of millions of people, the consequences fall on ordinary citizens. Trade disruptions, visa restrictions, reduced cooperation on drug trafficking and migration, these aren't abstract policy debates. They affect real families, real communities, real lives. The ideological guest list isn't just a diplomatic faux pas. It's a policy with casualties.
We should also note what The Guardian describes as Trump's approach being at times deadly. That language refers to the administration's aggressive immigration enforcement operations, including military deployments and deportation campaigns that have resulted in documented human rights concerns. This summit is taking place against that backdrop. The leaders attending are, implicitly or explicitly, endorsing that approach. The leaders excluded are the ones who've pushed back.
So what we're really witnessing is the formalization of a hemispheric divide, engineered from Washington. You're either in Trump's coalition, or you're on the outside. And for the countries on the outside, which happen to include the continent's three economic powerhouses, the message is clear: alignment with Washington requires political submission. That's not a partnership. That's a protection racket with canapes.
Now for something a little different, but stay with me, because this story has layers that are relevant to everything we cover on this show. Nature magazine reported this week on a fascinating discovery. Previously unexamined margin notes in Galileo Galilei's personal copies of scientific texts are revealing new insights into how one of history's greatest scientists actually developed his ideas.
And I know what some listeners might be thinking: what does a 400-year-old astronomer have to do with whistleblower news? Everything. Because the story of Galileo is the original story of what happens when an individual speaks truth to institutional power, and these newly analyzed margin notes are adding extraordinary detail to that narrative.
Nature's reporting covers how researchers are examining Galileo's scribbled notes, his private thoughts, his working calculations, the moments where he questioned established doctrine and worked through his observations. These aren't polished publications. They're the raw, unfiltered record of a mind challenging the most powerful institution of his era, the Catholic Church, which had declared that the earth was the center of the universe and that questioning that doctrine was heresy.
What makes this relevant to our modern moment is the process these notes reveal. Galileo didn't wake up one morning and decide to challenge the church. The margin notes show a gradual, painstaking journey. He tested, he doubted, he recalculated. He gathered evidence methodically. And then, when the evidence was overwhelming, he published, knowing full well that the institutional response would be punishment, not praise. He was right. He was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life.
And that pattern, the methodical gathering of evidence, the internal deliberation, the decision to go public despite knowing the personal cost, and then the institutional retaliation, that is the whistleblower's journey in every era. Edward Snowden did this. Daniel Ellsberg did this. Frances Haugen did this. Every person who has ever gathered evidence of institutional wrongdoing and decided to make it public has walked the same path that Galileo's margin notes are now illuminating in unprecedented detail.
Nature's briefing also contextualizes these findings within the broader study of how scientific knowledge evolves, not in clean, linear progressions, but through messy, contested, often dangerous acts of challenging orthodoxy. And here's the uncomfortable truth: we like to celebrate Galileo now, 4 centuries later, as a hero of science. But in his own time, the institutional response was swift and brutal. The powerful always punish truth-tellers first and vindicate them later, if at all.
There's also a lesson here about the importance of primary sources, which is something we take very seriously on this show. The margin notes are primary sources. They're unmediated, unedited, uncensored. They tell us something that Galileo's published works, which were subject to church censorship, could never reveal. The real story is always in the documents that weren't meant for public consumption. That's true in 17th century astronomy, and it's true in 21st century corporate and government misconduct.
And let's not miss the irony that these notes have survived 400 years. The institutional power that tried to silence Galileo, the church that forced him to recant, that banned his books, that confined him to his home, that institution eventually had to admit he was right. The evidence outlasted the censorship. The truth outlasted the power. That's not just a historical footnote. That's a promise to every whistleblower alive today: if the evidence is real, the truth will eventually prevail, even if the institutions fight it every step of the way.
It's a powerful reminder. Now let's talk about something very much of this moment. 2 Tesla Cybertrucks destroyed in a mysterious fire at a Santa Monica parking garage. Electrek is reporting that the Santa Monica Fire Department responded Wednesday to a blaze on the rooftop level of a 7-story parking structure. 2 Cybertrucks were completely destroyed, and several other Tesla vehicles were damaged. And here's the critical detail: neither truck was plugged in to charge at the time.
That detail is enormous, Alex, and it directly undercuts the most common deflection Tesla uses when its vehicles catch fire. The standard talking point is that the fire was related to charging, that it was an isolated battery event during the charging process. But neither of these Cybertrucks was charging. They were parked. They were sitting on the rooftop of a parking garage. And they caught fire with enough intensity to destroy both vehicles and damage surrounding cars. That demands an explanation.
Let's talk about what we know from the Electrek report. The Santa Monica Fire Department responded at approximately, and we should note the fire was significant enough to require a full department response at a 7-story structure, which means aerial ladder deployment, multiple engine companies, and evacuations. A rooftop parking garage fire is a serious structural concern because of the heat load on concrete decking. This wasn't a small event.
And here's what makes this particularly concerning from an engineering standpoint. The Cybertruck uses a stainless steel exoskeleton, Tesla's much-hyped ultra-hard 30x cold-rolled stainless steel body. One of the selling points of that material is its durability and resistance. But stainless steel is also an excellent conductor of heat. In a fire scenario, the exoskeleton could potentially distribute thermal energy across the vehicle's body in ways that a conventional painted steel or aluminum body panel would not. We need independent fire investigation reports to understand the thermal dynamics of what happened here.
And let's address the elephant in the room. Tesla vehicle fires have been a recurring issue, and the company's response has consistently been to downplay the frequency and severity while pointing out that gasoline car fires are statistically more common. But that comparison is misleading for several reasons. First, the installed base of gasoline vehicles is orders of magnitude larger. Second, lithium-ion battery fires burn differently, they're hotter, harder to extinguish, prone to reignition, and produce toxic fluoride gases. Fire departments across the country have had to develop entirely new protocols for EV fires.
And there's a regulatory dimension here that doesn't get enough attention. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, has investigated multiple Tesla fire incidents, but the Cybertruck is relatively new to the market. Its production history has been plagued with quality control issues, recalls, and design modifications. In fact, the Cybertruck has been subject to multiple recalls since its launch, covering issues from windshield wipers to accelerator pedals. The question is whether the fire risk represents another systemic design or manufacturing issue that should trigger a formal investigation.
We should also note the broader context of Tesla's relationship with government oversight right now. Elon Musk has been deeply embedded in the current administration through his role with the Department of Government Efficiency. That raises legitimate questions about whether regulatory agencies, NHTSA, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the EPA, feel empowered to pursue aggressive investigations of Tesla when the company's CEO has the ear of the president and is actively working to reduce the size and authority of the federal bureaucracy.
That's a conflict of interest so massive you can see it from space, and yet it barely registers in mainstream coverage. When the CEO of an automaker whose vehicles are catching fire is simultaneously helping to restructure the very agencies responsible for automotive safety, that's not just a story about a parking garage fire. That's a story about the erosion of the regulatory infrastructure that keeps all of us safe. Every car you drive past on the highway, every vehicle in your parking garage, exists within a safety framework that Musk is actively working to dismantle.
And let's talk about the people affected. If you're a resident of the building adjacent to that 7-story parking garage, you were evacuated Wednesday because 2 Cybertrucks caught fire. If you're the owner of one of the other Tesla vehicles that were damaged, your property was destroyed through no fault of your own. If you're a firefighter who responded, you were exposed to toxic fumes from a lithium-ion battery fire. These aren't abstractions. These are real consequences, and someone needs to be held accountable.
The Electrek report is straightforward in its presentation of the facts, and we should credit them for that. But the deeper investigation, the metallurgical analysis, the battery cell examination, the determination of the fire's origin, that's going to take weeks or months. And the question is whether that investigation will be conducted with full independence, or whether the political entanglements between Tesla's leadership and the federal government will cast a shadow over the process. Based on everything we've seen, skepticism is warranted.
One more point on this. The Cybertruck's design, the angular, stainless steel body, the unconventional construction, was marketed as revolutionary. But revolutionary doesn't mean safe. And when you have a vehicle that's been on the market for a relatively short period already accumulating fire incidents, the responsible thing is an immediate, transparent, and thorough investigation. Consumers deserve to know whether the vehicle in their garage is a fire risk. Full stop. Alright, let's bring it all together. We've covered 4 stories tonight that on the surface look completely unrelated. A food poisoning outbreak in Hong Kong. A politically curated summit in Florida. Galileo's margin notes. And Cybertrucks on fire in Santa Monica. But there is a thread running through every single one of these stories, and it's the thread that defines this era.
The thread is accountability, or more precisely, the systematic dismantling of accountability. In every story tonight, we saw institutions either obscuring information, excluding dissenting voices, or operating in a regulatory vacuum. The Hong Kong Department of Health won't name the police college. The White House won't invite leaders who disagree. Tesla's CEO is restructuring the agencies meant to oversee his own company. And Galileo's story reminds us that this isn't new. Power has always tried to silence, exclude, and evade accountability.
What's different now is the scale and the sophistication. 400 years ago, the church could ban a book. Today, you can restructure an entire regulatory agency. You can curate a diplomatic summit to exclude anyone who might push back. You can issue a health advisory that strategically omits the name of the institution responsible. The tools of accountability evasion have evolved, and they've become embedded in the infrastructure of governance itself.
And that's why the Galileo story isn't just a charming historical footnote. It's a warning and a promise. The warning is that institutional power will always move to protect itself, and the people who challenge it will always pay a personal price. The promise is that evidence endures. The margin notes survived 4 centuries. The truth about what happened in that police college kitchen will emerge. The fire investigation reports will eventually be written. The historical record of who was invited to that Miami summit, and who wasn't, is already being documented.
Our job, and your job as informed citizens, is to make sure that the truth doesn't take 400 years to surface. The whole point of investigative journalism, of whistleblower protections, of regulatory oversight, of democratic accountability, is to compress that timeline. To make sure the evidence is examined now, not in some future century when it's too late to matter.
So here's what we're asking you to do. Follow these stories. Ask the questions that the official statements are designed to prevent. Who is the food contractor at that Hong Kong training facility? Why were Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia excluded from the Miami summit? What does NHTSA's investigation timeline look like for the Cybertruck fires, and who's overseeing it? These are not rhetorical questions. They are actionable demands for transparency, and they only work if enough people keep asking them.
That's what Truth Report is about. Not just telling you what happened, but equipping you to demand answers. We verify our sources. We name the institutions. We follow the money and the power. And we come back every week to make sure nobody gets to quietly sweep these stories under the rug.
Before we go, let's recap what's at stake. 53 police trainees sickened in Hong Kong, with the government obscuring which institution is responsible. A hemisphere-shaping summit engineered to exclude dissent and reward ideological loyalty. A 400-year-old reminder that truth-tellers are always punished before they're vindicated. And a vehicle manufacturer whose CEO is dismantling the very agencies meant to investigate his product safety failures. These are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of an era in which accountability is treated as optional by the powerful.
And we refuse to accept that. We're Alex Truth and Maya Clarity, and this has been Truth Report. We cite our sources, tonight that includes the South China Morning Post, The Guardian, Nature, and Electrek. We name the institutions. And we'll be back next week to keep pulling at the threads that others want to leave buried. Until then, stay informed, stay skeptical, and never stop asking who benefits from your ignorance.
Because the truth doesn't report itself. Good night, everyone.